Rochard. I'm the VP of Research at Riot. Riot is one of the largest miners in the world. We are building out this facility to 750 megawatts of Bitcoin mining an hour north of Texas, or of Austin, Texas. If you're ever in the area in Austin, please let me know. I'd be happy to give you a tour of the facility. And if you're just interested in mining in general, please feel free to reach out to me. Okay, so Bitcoin at this point is one of the largest monetary settlement networks in the world. There was upwards of $60 trillion of value settled on Bitcoin over the past year. And it has grown rapidly. I think that it will continue to grow rapidly because of its fundamentals of the freedom to earn, save, and spend your money. But an open question that we often hear is, how is this network going to continue to be secured in the future? So when people talk about Bitcoin's security, often what they're talking about is the block reward, which represents the revenue going to Bitcoin miners. This block reward is a combination of two numbers. One, the subsidy. The subsidy is the new Bitcoin being added to the ledger. And two, the transaction fees that are being paid by transactors to get included inside of a block. So if we just zoom in on the subsidy, we're going to do a little bit of C++ this morning. And the subsidy is it's automatically calculated by the nodes. It's not the miners that decide how much revenue they earn. Obviously, that would be quite a conflict of interest. They would always be trying to add more inflation. Rather, it's all the Bitcoin nodes. And a Bitcoin node, for those not familiar, it's just a piece of software, and it's very resource efficient. So you can run a Bitcoin node on a cell phone, on a smartphone. You can run one on a Raspberry Pi, laptop, desktop computer, server, standard server. So it's somewhat the opposite of what we think of when we think of a Bitcoin mining rig, of something that's very energy intensive. And the reason is that the Bitcoin node is verifying all of the work. It's not performing the work. So as part of that verification, it recalculates the subsidy to make sure that the miner is not paying themselves too much money. And the way that the subsidy is calculated is really somewhat arbitrary in the sense that when Satoshi Nakamoto launched Bitcoin in 2009, he decided to have it be that 50 Bitcoin would get added to the ledger every 10 minutes, and then that quantity would get cut in half after every 210,000 blocks. 210,000 blocks times 10 minutes equals approximately 4 years. So what we see is that we have what has become called a halving or a halvening event every 4 years. So let's get into past halvings. Let's see yep, here we go. So the first 4 years, the subsidy was 50 Bitcoin. In 2012, the subsidy got cut in half to 25 Bitcoin. And at that point, in the first 4 years, half of Bitcoin's total supply was mined. Now, then in the next 4 years, 25% of it was mined, so the total percentage mined went to 75%. The subsidy got cut in half again to 12.5%, and then in 2020, most recently, to 6.25 Bitcoin. And in 2020, at that point, 87% of Bitcoin supply had been mined. The next halving is in approximately 2 years, a little bit less than 2 years now, to go to 3.125 Bitcoin, at which point 93% of the Bitcoin will have been mined, and so on and so forth until the year 2140, when the last Satoshi will be added to the Bitcoin ledger. This can be represented by this curve here, this actually shows the historical issuance, and you see that it's not if you look at the line that is the inflation rate, it's not as flat as you would expect because there actually is quite a bit of variance in time for blocks to come in. And it's also affected by hash rate generally going up. So when hash rate is exponential, that means that we're pulling in blocks from the future a little bit more quickly. So that's one of the reasons for why there's a little bit of noise. But in general, you see that there are these steep cliffs that happen in the inflation rate every 4 years that represent the halvings. And so now we're approximately a 2% increase in supply every year, and that is slowly drifting down until the next cliff in 2024, when we'll go to more like 1%. So in the Bitcoin white paper, Satoshi's view was that after all of these Bitcoin have been issued or added to the Bitcoin ledger, that then the incentive to mine would actually come only from transaction fees. And thus, we would not have any kind of inflation, and we would only ever have a maximum of 21 million Bitcoin. Now, I'll make an aside here, which is that we'll never reach 21 million Bitcoin for a number of technical reasons. We'll be a little bit below 21 million. If you're curious about that, I have an article at pierrerochard.com that details where these missing Bitcoin are going, because I performed a bit of an audit of Bitcoin supply, reconciling the issuance of Bitcoin with today's user balances. And I would also note that Bitcoin is the only asset in the world where you can perform this audit yourself independently using a Bitcoin node. No asset actually can do that. Even the supposed competitors in cryptocurrencies, they don't have the ability to do that. Maybe they will in the future, but despite my encouragement for them to do so, they still have not. Anyway, so the transaction fee is the sum of the, if you zoom in on a transaction, for those not familiar, a transaction is composed of two things. One is a set of inputs that are unlocking existing outputs. And then on the other side of the equation is a set of new outputs that you're creating that have new spending conditions. And interestingly, when you add up how much Bitcoin you're unlocking, it's going to be a little bit more than how much Bitcoin you're locking up. And that residual difference is the transaction fee that gets paid to the Bitcoin miner who's going to include that transaction in the block. Sorry, the slides are, maybe we need to replace the battery on. Okay, here we go. So I mentioned that the transaction fee gets paid to the miner. It gets paid in what's called a Coinbase transaction. This has nothing to do with the exchange Coinbase. Brian Armstrong stole this name from Bitcoin, which really reflects on his corporate ethics. But this name is actually about Bitcoin mining. It has nothing to do with exchanges. So the Coinbase transaction is the revenue for miners, or generally, more precisely, it's the revenue for mining pools. And the Coinbase transaction has no inputs, so it's a very special transaction. It's the only transaction that has no inputs, and it's always first in a block. And then the outputs are outputs going to addresses belonging to whoever mined this block. Now, the Coinbase transaction is, again, the sum of the outputs in the Coinbase transaction is going to be equal to the subsidy plus the sum of all the transaction fees for this particular block. Now, Satoshi mentioned that eventually transaction fees will replace the subsidy. Historically, if we look back at the end of 2017, during that bull market when the price went to an astronomical number of $20,000, which today is bearish, but back then it was very bullish, that the transaction fees on Bitcoin also skyrocketed because there was tremendous amount of demand to transact on the Bitcoin network and very limited supply. Why is there limited supply? Well, because of the famous block size limit. Before leaving the Bitcoin project in 2010, Satoshi put in place a limit on how big blocks could be in order to prevent denial of service attacks. Basically, the problem is that if somebody were to create a 1 gigabyte block, that would potentially cause the nodes to crash or to run out of resources. And then if all of the nodes are knocked off the network becomes centralized, and at that point, it's no different than the fiat system, where the centralized nodes would be able to change Bitcoin's monetary policy and add inflation and give themselves more money. So he put in place the block size limit. It has been very controversial throughout Bitcoin's history because there's not a right number for the block size limit. Satoshi picked 1 megabyte per block out of thin air. He didn't put together any kind of studies or analysis explaining why 1 megabyte was the correct number. So there's been lots of agitation about raising or lowering this limit as well. We've heard that controversy. So in any case, what this block size limit does is that it limits the supply of block space available to transactors, meaning that when there's a lot of demand, they have to compete for a scarce amount of supply, and that drives up transaction fees because the way that they compete is by bidding up their fee for their transaction in the mempool, which is a backlog of transactions waiting to get into the next block. So we see here that the percentage of miner revenue from fees actually was 50% at the end of 2017, meaning that half of the reward was the subsidy and the other half was the transaction fees. Now, since then, we've never seen those lofty percentages. In the previous bull market, 2 years ago now, in 2020 and 2021, transaction fees did pick up a little as the price skyrocketed to almost $70,000. But interestingly, it did not compare to what it was in 2017. Now, in the past couple of years, transaction fees have been very, very low, and that's an interesting question of why. Now, another way of looking at this data is to look at the ratio between how much value are we settling on the network versus the transaction fees. And we see that we've settled a record amount of value with very little transaction fees, with a historically small amount of transaction fees, which might seem a little bit paradoxical, right? We would expect the reverse, that if we're settling a tremendous amount of value, that we would be paying a tremendous amount in transaction fees. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin's transaction fees are not set by the amount of value that you're sending on the network. They're set by how much data are you consuming and how much concurrent demand is there for that data space. Okay, so why did transaction fees go down over the past 2 years? There's a lot of different explanations. I think that the most persuasive ones are, first of all, getting rid of some of the negative externalities. So what I mean by that is people using Bitcoin's network to settle forms of value other than BTC. And so, for example, Tether's USDT, they had a system called Omni where they would use, or I would argue, abuse Bitcoin's blockchain by putting transactions on it. And they decided to move to Tron. Okay, so Tron is another blockchain, but it's, arguably very centralized. And so I think that it reflects how little they care about finality, right? That they are happy to use any kind of public database. They don't really care about the assurances of that database. They don't care about the security of the database. Why? Why don't they care? Because USDT has a lot of value, right? The reason that they don't care about the security or the finality of the public database is that they also operate a private database, a SQL database, because at the end of the day, Tethers is a centralized stablecoin, right? It's not decentralized. It is issued by the Tethers Corporation and redeemed by the Tethers Corporation, and there's no decentralization to it. All they need is some kind of public database in order to essentially not have to operate or have a high transactional throughput on their private SQL database. Now, the second factor is the increased efficiency from Segwit. Segwit was an upgrade in 2017. You might have heard that Bitcoin is digital gold and thus a dumb rock that does not get upgrades and has ossified and nobody is developing on top of Bitcoin. And it turns out that's false. Bitcoin has had numerous upgrades throughout its history, and Segwit is one of those 5 years ago. Now, the nice thing about Bitcoin upgrades is that they are opt-in. They are opt-in because the users of Bitcoin, that is really the node operators, do not want to change their software. So if you've ever had the experience of having a pop-up saying, hey, we have an update available for your operating system or your application. And if there's the not now option, I would assume that 99% of you click not now, remind me later, right? Because if it works, why would I want to upgrade it, right? There's no reason for me to be upgrading something that is currently working. And in the world of open source, that is especially important. And in the world of a global consensus mechanism like Bitcoin, that is mission critical. That is that if the Bitcoin developers had the ability to push upgrades onto users and to force them to upgrade, that would just completely throw out any kind of decentralization. Now we're back to a fiat system, because now the developers, they could increase the supply above 21 million Bitcoin, right? And they could force that upgrade, quote unquote, downgrade onto everyone. So Bitcoin upgrades are opt-in. One of the downsides of this situation is that when we have a good upgrade like Segwit, it does take a while for adoption to happen. And it's only in the past 2 years that blockchain.com, which has the largest non-custodial wallet user base, and that's not an endorsement, please don't use blockchain.com for your Bitcoin wallet, but nevertheless, they have the largest user base. And so when they finally adopted Segwit, 4 years after Segwit had activated, they dramatically reduced their footprint on chain, and so that actually freed up a lot of space for a lot of other people, and it lowered competition for block space and thus lowered transaction fees. And third, we've just had steady sideways transactional demand, right? We haven't had a massive wave of increase in Bitcoin on-chain transactional demand, perhaps because of the advent of the Lightning Network, where now for people who are using Bitcoin for day-to-day payments, oh, blue screen of death. Okay. When they're using Bitcoin for day-to-day payments, it makes a lot more sense to use Lightning. Lightning has tremendous advantages over on-chain Bitcoin for those kinds of use cases. Namely, it's instant, so you don't have to wait around in the coffee shop for 30 minutes waiting for your finality. And it's also, the fee on Lightning is not charged based on the amount of data that you're using. It's actually based on it's a percentage of the value that you are sending or receiving, or well, rather sending. So meaning that you can buy your cup of coffee and pay a fraction of a percent as the fee for that transaction. Whereas on Bitcoin, it wouldn't really matter if, even if Bitcoin transaction fees are very low, like they have been, it's still approximately 5 cents worth of sats that you have to pay for a transaction fee. And so if you're buying a $2 cup of coffee, that would be a 2.5% charge on your coffee, whereas with Lightning, you could be paying 0.01%, much more competitive. So, let's see, next slide. No. Oh. No more slides. Flying blind. Okay, here we go. So here's an illustration of the tethers supply that I mentioned earlier. So in red is the Omni, and then in green is Ethereum, and in blue is Tron. So you see that Bitcoin, we got rid of this negative externality and foisted it onto other networks, and that's really great news. The Segwit adoption is now at almost 100%. I think it was like 85% last I checked. So massive improvement, and you see that it happened very recently over the past couple of years. We had that big jump. And this is the daily median block size. So I mentioned earlier that Satoshi had in place the 1 megabyte block size limit. And, oh, I've got a laser pointer. You see the block size limit here, this ceiling. And then in orange, you see the Segwit upgrade at the end of 2017. And so now you see the median block size is above 1 megabyte. It's a marginal increase in capacity. But in terms of decentralization, that's what we want. We would not want a 10x increase in capacity, because that would mean that it's 10 times more expensive to run a Bitcoin node, and that would make Bitcoin 10 times less decentralized. And then this is an illustration of the transactional demand, which is outputs created every month. And so you see here that there is a base amount of supply, if you kind of cut off the hype cycles, that has been steadily increasing. And if you look at the ceilings, though, we've been sideways mostly for the past few years. And I think that is reflective of both kind of getting rid of non-BTC transactions, but also shifting demand to Lightning. Okay, this is an excellent diagram. So, let's talk about what the life cycle is here for transaction fees. So a diagram that I developed with Blockware Solutions, shout out to Joe, is that really the transaction fees cause scaling improvements to happen. So for example, with Segwit, one of the motivations for blockchain.com to adopt Segwit transactions into their wallet is that their users would save money by paying a lower transaction fee by being more efficient. And so their users would demand Segwit adoption in order to save money. And so we see here that as transaction fees go up, we see more adoption, more development of scaling technologies, and that causes fees to decrease. And with lower transaction fees, that attracts new adoption as well for the Bitcoin network. And that new adoption is going to drive up transaction fees, and so on and so forth. So our baseline expectation would be that transaction fees will continue to be volatile going forward, where we will have bull markets in transaction fees that are based on demand going more quickly than increases in supply or scaling solutions. And then as supply comes online in the form of scaling solutions, then that will absorb the demand and drive down transaction fees back down to a much lower level. Now this is a little bit smaller, but one of the concerns that you might hear is about, well, what if transaction fees are too low and that opens Bitcoin up to a 51% attack? Now, the problem with this analysis of transaction fees is that transaction fees are dynamic. And so you would only expect transaction fees to go up in response to a 51% attack, not in anticipation of one. Doing it in anticipation of one would be like, being a store owner and, shooting people who enter your store because one of them might be a thief. So it doesn't make sense. You want to confirm that that person is hostile before you actually put cost into fighting them off. And so it would be very inefficient if transaction fees were to be always high in order to prevent a hypothetical 51% attack. And in practice, even when Bitcoin transaction fees have been low, we have not seen a 51% attack. So it might be the case that any attacker understands that the game theory would mean that they would eventually lose, and so there's no point in mounting the attack in the first place, on top of kind of the logistical costs of doing so. You'll hear folks say, oh, well, the reason that Bitcoin has not had a 51% attack yet is because the subsidy is so high that it actually means that it would be too expensive to attack it today, even if transaction fees are low, right? Because the mining reward is subsidy plus transaction fees. The problem with that theory is that the attacker does not necessarily have to purchase mining rigs, ASICs, right? They could actually just be a hacker who is going to hijack hash rate in order to perform the attack. In fact, that would be the most cost-effective way of doing the attack. And yet we still have not seen anyone even attempt that. So there's serious questions about what the value of a 51% attack would be. And lastly, you'll hear people mention state actors. So a large government deciding that, hey, we don't like Bitcoin, and so we're going to invest a lot in Bitcoin mining in order to perform a 51% attack. And the idea here being that a government has an infinite number of resources and that they don't care about the economics of losing money, they're just trying to destroy Bitcoin. The problem with this theory is that there's always an assumption that there's only one government. There are lots of different governments throughout the world. They're always competing with each other and at odds with each other. And so the likelihood that there's only one government interested in attacking Bitcoin seems improbable. There would actually more likely be several governments trying to attack Bitcoin at the same time and failing to cooperate and thus not getting enough hash rate, or even governments being favorable towards Bitcoin and because they lack monetary sovereignty in any case, so they would actually have an incentive to profitably mine Bitcoin for themselves and to defend the network. So all this to say that the low transaction fees are not a problem for Bitcoin's long-term security. They're only good for users. And the only reason we've had high transaction fees in the past has not been because of attackers or in order to defend the network, but rather due to congestion that has not been met by increased supply of block space through scaling technologies. So I think I already said some of this. The underlying cause of high transaction fees is this herd mentality, right? Everyone decides to get into Bitcoin at the same time, and that's what is driving these waves. And then we also don't know when the Bitcoin Core researchers who are geniuses, when they're going to come up with their next scaling solution. And it also takes a while for these scaling solutions to work themselves through Bitcoin's decentralized governance process of having activation on chain. All right, any questions? I'm not sure how much time we have left for questions. I might have been a little slow there. You can reach me on Twitter as well, at BitcoinPierre. My DMs are open, so if you want to talk about Bitcoin mining, Riot, or transaction fees, feel free to reach out.
Hi, Pierre.
Yep.
About the fees back in 2017, 2018, it looks like there was also an attack in the network by people filling up the blocks with fake transactions in order to increase the fees, right? They have some evidence of that.
I agree. There is evidence that there was a series of spam attacks in 2017 in order to promote the cause of doubling the block size limit with the 2x hard fork, and also to promote competing blockchains, whether it's Ethereum or Bcash at the time. But I agree that that is a risk. Now, the nice thing is that the attacker, all that happened is that they lost money.
Well, not really. If these were miners putting fake transactions that they mine themselves without broadcasting to the network, they can just fill the blocks for free. And I did some statistical analysis, and there's some evidence that something like this was going on with some miners. You just fill with your own transactions and you don't broadcast, right?
Yeah, the problem with that is they're still losing money because they're not including third-party transactions. And so
they can include third-party, but they fill with their own transactions with high fees in order to increase the average fee, so that the wallets are tricked into this into increasing the fees.
At the margin, it would always make sense to not include their own transaction and include a third-party transaction. And so because of that marginal effect, I think they would always be having an opportunity cost in spamming their own blocks.
Yeah, but if there are not enough transactions, that the mempool is empty.
But that wasn't the case. There was massive backlogs in the mempool from third-party transactions.
Just take even if the mempool is full, you just take out just the transactions with very small fees and fill it with your own transactions with very high fees that you mine yourself, they don't broadcast, so you're not losing money. And then this makes the average fee going up. This is a weakness of the protocol, that people can do that.
There's always the ability as a third-party transactor to do RBF, or child pays for parent, to increase your transaction fee in order to compete against the miner. And so there's always going to be an opportunity cost for the miner to include their own transaction and pay themselves instead of including somebody else's transaction and make more money. So they certainly lost money on that attack.
Well, we can discuss it later, but I don't think so. You can, if the increase in the average fee,
they would have continued, right? And
if you are able to increase the average fee transaction, you make money.
In theory.
Sorry?
Perhaps in theory, but in practice, they lost money.
Well, I mean, just look at the blocks at this time. It's curious.
Because if that were a profitable strategy, they would always be doing that.
No, because it's not. I mean, people do that, and and people spot that and can single it out. It gives a reputation
and do what?
problem.
According to you, there's no mitigation for it.
Yeah.
So, other than social pressure on Twitter or something.
Well, I mean, maybe
if
these are pools, I mean, miners can move to other pools if some pools are doing these manipulations,
Well, so unless the pools are sharing that revenue with miners.
Yeah, well, but they increase the revenue for everyone. I mean, if you can, it's very simple to do that. You can do that. If you are a big pool or a big miner, you can just increase the fees without much cost to you. I mean, just remove the very low transactions with very low fees and just put fake transactions to yourself with very high ones. So.
I refuse to believe that miners are being economically irrational and not performing this.
No, but this is economically rational, and in particular, there is a war on block size, and you want to make a point. This looks like what was happening.
So you're making an argument that it is profitable to stuff blocks with your own transactions, and it is ideologically driven. My argument is that it is unprofitable to do so because otherwise non-ideological miners would do it all the time. And what we see is that that's not what has occurred over the past 2 years, for example, of very low transaction fees. And the idea that miners are not making more money out of the goodness of their hearts seems unrealistic in my mind. And so that's why I don't believe that this is possible.
Well, no, but that in 2017 there were other discussions about block size. So they were making a point that
Understood.
I mean, the big argument was fees are very high, and we see that fees are really not very high. Now
So
they're very
I
low.
agree they were making an ideological point, but I'm just saying that they were losing money doing so.
Well, maybe, but not that much. I don't think that much. It's a very cheap attack. Well.
Thank you, Pierre, for your presentation. I had a question about the potential other sources of income for miners beside fees and mining reward. I mean, a bit outside of technical, but mining economics, basically, what's to come in the coming future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So last month, Riot announced that we earned more revenue from selling power back to the grid than from Bitcoin mining. And we did that by turning off the mining rigs when electricity prices were very high. And so that has two effects. One, it helps push electricity prices down, which is great for everyone else on the grid. And so that stabilizing factor is positive. Two, during those peak demand times, when electricity grid prices skyrocket, what happens is that coal and natural gas peaker plants kick on. And so those are the, if the concern is about climate change and carbon emissions, turning off a Bitcoin mine is much better, or infinitely better, than turning on a coal-fired power plant. And then in terms of the mining economics, I think that it has no effect on the Bitcoin network, basically. That there's no concern in my mind that even if all of the Bitcoin miners were in Texas and that they turned off for 4 hours, that there would be a significant problem because actually what you would see is during those 4 hours, transaction fees would start going up, and that would incentivize people outside of Texas to turn on their miners and to contribute to the network. And so Bitcoin mining in that regard is very anti-fragile in its incentives. So I can't think off the top of my head of other immediately adjacent revenue sources for Bitcoin miners. And also, it is the case that the ability to sell power back to the grid like this is highly dependent on what contract you have. So Riot has a contract with TXU. TXU is a subsidiary of Vistra, publicly traded company. And their contract is a 10-year fixed rate contract that was entered into 2 years ago when electricity prices were much lower than they are today. Vistra at the time thought they were getting a great deal because they thought presumably that electricity prices were going to continue to go down, which is kind of what one would expect based on increased economies of scale in power production. And it's really only because of kind of geopolitical issues and the energy prices have gone up anyway. So I don't know if that's always going to be the case that Bitcoin miners can earn that much money from contributing electricity back to the grid. Hopefully it's not, right? Because we want everyone to have low electricity costs. I think that's good for humanity, for electricity prices to be low. Now, I do think that today when we look at transaction fees, we're looking at an exceptional period, right? We're looking at the worst bear market in transaction fees in Bitcoin's history, arguably. And I think that that's not going to be the case going forward. Now, these views are my own, right? There's no just fortune telling here. But I think that if we look at the scaling technology, the low-hanging fruit have been picked. and that there are significant advantages as well. I mentioned the advantages of Lightning in the context of buying your coffee. The advantages of on-chain with regards to your long-term savings are tremendous, because on-chain you can be in cold storage, right, with a multi-sig, and you can receive money offline, right, in the sense that with a Lightning node you have to be online to be able to receive money. So there are significant advantages on the other side for on-chain. It's a set of trade-offs, and that's why I'm still very bullish on transaction fees. All right, thank you.